All right. So, Pratap, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Sam.
I've known about you for a long time, obviously, as everybody does in the industry, but we've never crossed paths, despite me living in Coventry and the Leamington area for a long time and working in Whitley and
All right. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. I was doing some LinkedIn stalking and looking at your backstory. And I before we get into your education and all and studying and all that sort of stuff, I was interested to know what it was like growing up where you grew up, and
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
so we generally do things that are like quite biographical. You know, we're really interested in journey and personal processes, and it's fascinating that a young boy from India goes to the heights that you did, and that's the fascinating story in this. So, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear about that. So I wondered what it was like growing up where you grew up and how you came to the epiphany of wanting to become a car designer.
Oh, yeah. Great. So, of course, Sam, thanks for having me. Like you said, we haven't, our paths may have crossed, but we haven't met. So great to see you here. Um, I was, of course, born and raised in Bombay, and, through the 70s and 80s. And if anyone knows anything about India, it's not the most automotive of places in the world. It sort of started its automotive journey quite late in the sort of industrial age, let's put it that way. In fact, had a very small government-controlled automotive manufacturing, let's say, business. There were only two cars available. One was, the Fiat 1100, sort of, and the other one was a version of the Morris Oxford, and that sort of carried on for many, many years. And believe it or not, there was a waiting list for these cars because they were the number you could produce was regulated by the government.
Wow.
Not only cars, everything, soap, you name it, any consumer product. And then in the 90s, the economy opened up, and what we call sort of economic reform, and that's when actually the automotive industry started taking off. So in the mid to early 90s. So, that's the kind of environment, Sam, that I grew up in. And because it was such a limited domestic automotive industry, the people who could afford cars, apart from those two, would be able to import cars into India. And, so this would be businessmen, industrialists, movie stars. So they would, there was the Chevy Impala and, all those sort of Americana cars. And of course, amongst the German cars, I think Mercedes-Benz was probably the key product that, people would import into India. Whoever could pay that kind of money and import taxes and duties. So when you'd see let's say imported car, Sam, it was it was like seeing a spaceship on the road.
Wow.
And, I happened to see a 280 SEL, I still remember, metallic blue. And for anyone who knows Bombay, there's a very iconic hotel called the Taj Mahal Hotel, which is right, 10 minutes from my place and right on the Arabian Sea. Very beautiful setting. And that was actually one of the first 5-star hotels that the Taj Group or the Tata Group built. And it was one of the first 5-star hotels in all of Asia. One day I was walking along the sea and I saw this beautiful, blue 280 SEL in front of this stunning Taj Mahal hotel. And I said to myself, look, someone designs the building. That much I knew. I knew about architecture. But I said, surely such a beautiful car is also designed by someone or there is a profession. So that was that epiphany moment.
What sort of age
Funnily,
is this?
I would have been around 13 or 14, Sam.
Wow.
Like I said, car design or design in general, I didn't know much about. I always drew and stuff. I knew about art. I started to know about architecture. In fact, that's what I wanted to probably become. That's what I would have become had I not had that moment where you realize that there's something called car design as a profession. And in those days, you did whatever research you could. You went to a library. You couldn't just, Google it. There were obviously analog means to find out things. And then even automotive journalism, because there was nothing to write about. So even automotive journalism was very young in those days. There were very few magazines. So, finding out about car design was quite difficult. And but then one found out about design schools, and then you did a little more research. I visited a couple of them and saw that, there were students there who were studying product design, but were doing car design projects as a part of
was this? Sorry, was this in India now?
Yeah, still in India,
Okay.
So there were only two design colleges. One was in Bombay and the other one was in a city called Ahmedabad, very popular, a very famous design school, I would say, National Institute of Design. And that's when I decided, look, I'm going to finish school and go there and study product design, because there was no car design as a specialty. And I would choose car design projects as I studied design. So I did a 5-year bachelor's course there. And some of my final projects or projects towards the end of that course were all car related. But yeah, that if there's epiphany, it's that moment. I still remember so clearly, the sun, the sea, this beautiful building and that beautiful car. So, that 280 SEL has a lot to do.
Shout out to the 280 SL.
Yeah, has got a lot to do with me becoming a car designer. So,
Pratap, what were your parents like towards your aspiration of wanting to become this go on this journey that didn't exist, that was completely alien to them and to everybody?
You're absolutely. I mean, the perfect question, Sam. In those days, in the 90s, and even now, many parents in India think that there are just 2 or 3 professions that make any sense. If you're an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer, or a accountant, these are what you do if you want to have a decent life.
Right.
So when I said, look, I want to study design, their vision of being a designer was, someone who goes around with a bag of sketch pens, So my dad didn't think there was a career. And to be honest and fair to him, there wasn't actually. But it's just one of those things, it's one of those things you want to do. When I got into the National Institute of Design, which is very hard school to get into, it's a very, very lengthy process. At least it was in those days to gain admission there. And when I got in there, they started sort of believing that there's something in this. They visited the campus with me. They saw what people were doing. There was textile design, graphic design, product design. It's multidisciplinary. And I think that's when they started to understand what design was about. And, look, in the end of the day, I was fortunate for them to say, choose whatever you want to choose, but be the best at what you choose. And that stuck with me, just to be the best at whatever choice we made, as kids. So, yeah.
Pratap, can I just ask, with regards to you deciding on this product design route and doing this automotive specialism, did you believe in your inside that one day you would work for an international OEM, or were you just kind of hoping for the best? You said, I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to give it a good shot. Was there kind of was it a bit naive looking back, or did you just have sheer hard focus and determination?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I wanted to work for, some of the best companies out there because there was very limited scope in India in those days. So I knew, to be able to excel in the profession, you would have to probably try and get into one of these big companies. And the other thing was, and the second part of the question, I would only answer, there's some things you can control, Sam, and some you can't. So I couldn't control which company I would get into, at that stage. But what I could control was really being obsessed about, my education in design. I remember, I used to spend hours looking at, of course, products, yes, but because it was a product design course, but hours looking at how cars were put together from that limited, amount of cars you would see on the road. Why would some cars look better put together than others? And you would notice the details like rain channels and, waist moldings and how the bumpers fit and the shut lines. You start becoming conscious and aware of why things look the way they do and why they work the way they do. So I think the design school experience really, taught me to look at things in a lot of microscopic detail, but also to be able to zoom out, not get lost in the details and see the larger picture. And I always say that to designers, that don't get lost in the details unless you understand where it fits in the bigger scheme of things. So yeah, going back to your question, it's actually a bit of both. I wanted to work for the best brands because that was the only thing we could do at that point. But I also wanted to, be able to control what I could control at that point. And that was purely, the studies and the project that I did. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then it says on your first proper job was at Piaggio. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely right, Sam.
And
when I graduated,
how did that come about?
Yeah, interesting story. So when I graduated, like I said, limited scope. So I sent my little portfolio everywhere I could think of. In those days, you didn't send PDFs. You literally sent, printed folders. Anyone of my generation will know, there were these, little booklets you would make and you would mail them, right? Physically. So
I did that as well.
Yeah. You remember you had to go to a print shop, get it printed, get it trimmed, get it bound, make it into a little mail shot. And then I sent it everywhere. That's the other thing I always say, just take the chances. So I sent it everywhere. And, some responses, yes, no, you need a degree in car design if you want to work in our studio, things like, which I didn't have. I didn't have a bachelor's in car design. It was industrial design. But then there was this one company in Delhi, Piaggio. They had a small office. So it's an Italian company, as you know, but they had a small liaison office in Delhi. They were planning to get into the Indian market in those days with two-wheelers, with scooters. So I met some of the people there and said, look, we only have a small office here in Delhi, but our main R&D is in Italy. What we can do is we'll arrange for a 6 months, they call it a stage, a trial, a kind of internship. Would you be interested? So it wasn't a job. So I said, yeah, I have nothing to lose. So I grabbed onto that opportunity. I went there. I was given a project to to modify, if anyone knows a Lambretta, to modify a Lambretta, because that was going to be their product for India. And I saw that and I said, look, you guys have no chance. If you go to India with a product like this, you're going to fail in the first day. You don't go to India, which is a market which is exploding. I'm talking about the mid 90s by then. Like I told you, post liberalization. Sort of late 90s. I said, if you go with this sort of product, forget it, because it'll just not work. And and funnily enough, they dropped that project, not only because of what I said, but I think they did some more research and said, yeah, this guy's right. And then the design thinking started clicking. How what product you would do to address a aspirational market like India. Aspirational but still with a limited, ability to buy. These are two very important things that many foreign companies, when they come to India, they get it wrong. They have aspirational products, but at an unreachable price point. And that's why they fail. Or they reduce the price point, but they give such a poor product that no one thinks it's aspirational. So that's why also they fail. So this balance of aspirational and affordable, and I think you'll understand that,
Yeah.
Sam, as well.
Yeah.
That balance for a developing or emerging market is super important. And I think that's some of the things I started talking about there. But when my 6 months were kind of coming to an end, by then I was working on some of their normal European scooter programs, for Gilera, for Vespa, for Piaggio brand. And, they said, look, if you want to carry on here, we are ready to offer you a job. Why don't you think about it? So I said, yeah, I loved the 6 months here and I want to sort of carry on working. So I sort of made that stage we converted that into a full-time role. And, those 2.5, 3 years in Pisa, Pontedera were incredible. I learned a lot. I mean, first of all, it was automotive. It was a real studio. They didn't use clay. As many people know, in Italy, the use of clay was very, very limited because they came from the plaster school of thought. And in Piaggio, we would use, hard foams. So, so there was only a certain way that the modeler's hand would move, with his tools, because it's a hard on hard, and that's what gave rise to a certain design and form language. And I didn't know that,
Wow.
because of the tools they use, because of the way the hands move, because of the material they were manipulating. Those were the shapes that actually emerged. And then you start understanding, how and why the tools are so linked to Italian sense of beauty, because it's from their sculptural background, right? I mean, from sculpture, they see automotive as sculpture on wheels, and those things started really, dawning on me, and I loved that. I loved those, sort of, like I said, 2.5, 3 years, and it was so linked then to, their lifestyle, their food, their way of living. A Vespa is a perfect product in Italy, because when you're driving around in Rome or in Palermo or in Milan, it fits so beautifully to their architecture, to their light. You stop in a cafe and you have an espresso. So it's so intrinsically linked to the way of living. So these are some of the things I learned, much beyond product design and what I had for, the last 5 years.
Pratap, did you do a lot of strategic learning, like design planning and design strategy at university? Or was that something that came intuitively to you?
I would say it came slightly more intuitively, because at the National Institute of Design, NID, design was very much a problem solving process. And like I said, you did projects which were technically very complex. You did some projects which were, a systems design, where you talk about, let's say, transportation for a town or a city, or so this ability to scale up and down, zoom in and out of a situation, Sam. I think that's fundamental to being a successful designer, in any field. Yes, you have to know your art, you have to know your product and whatever you're designing, but you must always know the context in which it fits. And if you get the understanding of both of these, then I think you can really stand out as a designer. So I think that strong product design, industrial design, basic background education for me was useful because of what we went through, and the way we studied design. And then, I applied it, Sam, throughout my life. In fact, as you know, and many people will know, when you start in your career, you are more on the doing side. When you're a junior designer, you're more about sketches, you're more about that skill and the craft of design, and you improve that and you work and you go to tapes and clays and whatever. at my stage in the career, you're much more about the other side. You're much more about strategy. It's not about, how to design a car. It's why you do a
absolutely,
product in the first
yeah.
place.
But this
Where
is
does it fit?
sorry,
Sorry?
no, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry. But what's quite interesting there is was your insight to say that the Lambretta, for example, would not work in India because
Yeah.
based on what? Because that would be deemed as a relatively aspirational product. But are you saying was it too expensive or it
No.
just didn't? What did you mean by that?
So, Sam, this was a purely design problem. Now, let me explain to you again. If you, based on what I said earlier, the market was never an open market till the mid 90s, right? So, whatever you saw there was kind of frozen in time. So, India didn't have a phase where you had products from the 70s and 80s, and then you had great products from the 90s, etc. And then you did something retro and went back. So retro didn't, the old stuff never went out of the visual environment, so if you took something retro back into that, it wouldn't be seen as a modern product.
Right.
So if you took, let's say, I'll take some names, if you took a Mini back to India, then people would think it's an old product, just like the Morris
Okay.
Oxford.
I'm with you. Okay.
Because nothing modern came in between in the first place. You can only have retro when you did something modern in between and you go back to something, right? Here you don't go back to anything because that's what the reality is.
Right. Okay.
So
I'm with you.
So you would have to go to India at that point with something real. That's true even today, by the way. That's why no retro product has worked in India recently, because we haven't come out of that phase really as a generation.
Fascinating. I've got a question that's kind of linked to this, but we'll save it for later about the Sierra. So you spent a couple of years at Piaggio, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what made you decide to go and apply to the RCA?
So Sam, as you can imagine, life in that part of Italy, Toscana was amazing. There was literally nothing you can complain about. The food, the weather, the work. But, I always wanted to design cars. So for me, that wasn't sort of the end. It was a step towards designing cars. And I knew from my previous experience that if you don't have a degree in car design, actually, it's quite hard to get a job at an automotive OEM studio. So, I've always wanted to do the RCA. Of course, it was unaffordable for someone coming out of India because of the fees in London at the college. So I did two things. One is I applied for a scholarship, and the second was I applied to the RCA. And it was funny, the scholarship I would only get if you actually got into the school in the first place. So the people who are giving the scholarship would not consider your application for the scholarship unless you could show that you had got into the college. So it was like, okay. So I applied. I did the interview by phone in those days. And they offered me the place in RCA. I took that offer letter, went to the scholarship people and said, look, I got into, the school, like you've said. And we went through a rigorous process. But that scholarship is also very, very, you can imagine the number of people applying for some of those scholarships in India to study abroad. And, fortunately, I sort of won that scholarship. So I went to the RCA because I really wanted to, like I said, wanted to specialize in automotive design, because I didn't have that sort of, not automotive design, in car design, let me put it that way. And, to make that eventual jump to designing cars. So, yeah, that's what, I sort of, in a way, gave up that great life in Pisa and, moved to London.
Were you not tempted to study at any of the Italian schools, or was it very much like RCA was the holy grail and that's where you wanted to go?
Yeah, Sam, for me, somehow RCA was a holy grail. When you did the research into who was heading the design studios in various OEMs, more often than not, in those days, in the late 90s, early 2000s, most of the names that popped up when you did any research was, studied in the RCA, studied in the RCA. So it was that really, and I wanted a master's degree. Don't forget, I had already done the bachelor's, so I didn't want to sort of go back through 3 or 4 years of a bachelor's in automotive. So at that point, I thought RCA was the best master's in car design you could get. I mean, naive, or I didn't know enough. I'm sure there are others, but that's just the place I wanted to come to. And that's what I did.
Pratap, can you talk to me about internships at all? I mean, Piaggio started out as an internship. Did you do any other internships?
Yeah, funnily enough, in my in NID, I did one internship every year, and though you don't have to as a part of your education, you got to do only one of them in the fourth year. But I did one in the second, third, fourth, and fifth year. I thought that was again somewhere very important to to understand how education fits in industry. I really wanted to know how the outside world works. So I would find an internship every year, and I did that. But the one in the fourth year, the official one, was actually at Tata Motors.
Had they established a studio in India yet?
Yeah, they had a studio. They were, of course, much more in the commercial vehicles, truck design side.
Right.
Because Tata Motors started as a truck maker really, and they were just moving into some cars in the early 90s. I'm talking about 94. And funnily enough, we've just launched a car called the Safari, the fourth generation product. They were designing the first generation of that when I did my internship. So I couldn't dream in my life that 22 years or 25 years later, we're going to launch a car that me and the team worked on. So yeah, the internship was important. It was great. Some of the people who actually were, let's say, my studio guides in that internship, there are some of them still working in Tata Motors design. They're very, very important part of my team. And it's incredible. And I always say, therefore, treat people well throughout your life, in whatever you do, wherever you go, because you never know when it comes back full circle. So those people who, let's say, the senior designers at that point at Tata Motors who took such great care of me, they are today part of my team. And they're still, amazing designers and amazing people, So you never know what happens. So, that's the fundamental rule, be nice to people along the way.
That's fantastic advice.
Then internship, the second one was between the first and second year at RCA. I went to Daihatsu in Japan. That's actually when I fell in love with Japan. So I went to Osaka for 8 weeks. Daihatsu, Toyota, most Japanese companies have a very well structured, internship. And I did 8 weeks of that in a place called Ikeda, just outside Osaka. I went from London to Japan for those 8 weeks. Again, another incredible experience, to work with the clay modelers, Japanese clay modelers, who spoke very little English. There again, your skill as a designer is so important. We are the few people, Sam, designers in general, who don't really need a spoken language. Your visual language, your ability to just draw on a sheet of paper, draw a section, draw a form, a shape, is so fundamental to what we do. Because I worked in Italy, none of the modelers knew English. I didn't know any Italian when I first went there. Same in Japan, 8 weeks, what do you come to know? But you could work with them because ours is a visual language, and visual and tactile language. When you touch the clay, you can just sort of gesticulate that you want it a little more tense, or you want it a little more negative, or whatever it was. And we managed to make the models like that. So again, those 8 weeks in Japan in 2001-2 were phenomenal, and I always think that 8 weeks in Daihatsu is another great foundation in whatever I've done.
I had a guy who's become a bit of a friend now, Alan DeRosier, who went out to Japan as well, and he said it was like an absolute baptism of fire, but he loved it. And they were talking about him. This I don't know if it was the same where you were, but they were talking about themes, about sketching themes, not just making graphical gestures on a flat surface. Was this a thing at your time as well?
Yeah, it was a lot to do with capturing a theme first. And they call it thema for some reason. I don't know why. But, whenever we presented to, let's say, the senior designers and then to the general manager before you went to make the model, you had to really capture the theme of what you're doing. And I remember I found it quite difficult at Daihatsu, because Daihatsu is one of those brands which doesn't have, and doesn't need, by the way, not all brands need a consistent design language across the products. Daihatsu literally designs products for what they are, and that's what works for them. They don't have a corporate design language and identity and all of that. So when you go there, it's actually quite difficult to design a Daihatsu. It's not easy. And, so like you said, to capture this theme, that someone would see the drawing and immediately understand what it was very important. Again, there was this problem of language, so you had to do things visually. But nailing a theme, nailing this sort of concept of what you're doing was very important. And he's right. Alan is right. It's so fundamental to the Japanese approach to car design.
And just with regards to corporate identity, are you is it also a Japanese thing that they want like every single car to be a complete blank sheet of paper? Is that in some cases,
is that
a Japanese
Sam,
thing?
It is like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I did see. I mean, if you look at the 4 generations of the Micra, for example, you'll see a complete difference in the way they approach the product. Look at the Corollas. If you look at the 6 or 7 generations of a Corolla and you compare it to 6 or 7 or 8 generations of a Golf, you'll see that difference very clearly. So, but I think it's got something to do with the impermanence of Japan. Japan itself changes every 3 or 4 years. You go to Tokyo, you go in 2 years, there'll be a new building where earlier there was something else. So I think, and because, Japan is prone to natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, I think they have something to do with the temporary nature of things, as opposed to permanence. The buildings are made of paper and wood, many of the houses. So I don't think they get stuck in, like trying to create some sort of great design legacy. They go to each product, they approach that in a fresh way, and they start from there. And that's what I think. That's what I put it down to. There's a temporariness in the Japanese way of life for certain things, of course. And I think it's extremely exciting, and it's just another philosophy. It's another way of doing things. So this impermanence of the world around, that in a flash a city can be destroyed by a tsunami or an earthquake, which has happened right in the recent past.
Sure.
You look at the Kobe earthquake, you look at the tsunami that hit them a few years ago. So this thing of renewal, refreshing, doing something new, I find that quite exciting. It may not be the way European brands approach design, but that's why the design world is so interesting.
That's a fascinating insight. And it's a really good one as well. And it answers a lot of things, because the first thing I thought about was Toyota. It's like every single Corolla looks completely different. And they often get knocked for it, and I rightly or wrongly so. It's very interesting. I think as a student, something that is something that's constantly changing, that's always a blank sheet of paper, would arguably be more appealing. But then the longer you find yourself, the longer you are in the industry and you get used to a certain thing and a certain lineage, you become you need this kind of this consistent growth, a legacy, as you talked about. So that, like, with regards to, again, you linking that back to culture in their products is a fascinating insight, and it probably answers a lot of questions. So that was great.
That's good. By the way, Sam, that's my understanding. I lived in Japan, as you know, for 4 years, and that's what I sort of concluded in the end. I mean, the Toyota has, for example, there are so many Toyotas on the road, and they have 3 or 4 different types of dealership networks. The badge on the front of the car is not always a Toyota logo. So they have something called the Vitz. It's got a symbol of its own. The Harrier has a kind of eagle, and then so even the front badge of the car, they are not sort of stuck to some sort of rules that someone else has defined. And I asked, one of my colleagues that why do some of the Toyota cars have the T logo at the back and the front is a model logo, if it's a Crown or if it's this Vitz or whatever it is. And he said, look, there's so many of them on the road. If everything was a Toyota, it would just be overwhelming. People would only see Toyotas on the road and it would be boring. It would be overwhelmingly boring. And again, there you see, we have such the Western idea of corporate identity and all of that is so rigid in its execution and in its thought, actually. But I found it so flexible, so interesting in Japan as well. So, like I said, there's no right or wrong. It's just what you choose to do, and you do it with conviction, and I think that's what matters. And I found that fascinating. I mean, I also asked, in Japan, sometimes some companies may have a product gap, right? So for example, Nissan made nothing the size of an entry level car, really small. So they would go to Suzuki and rebadge the car Nissan and sell it at the dealership. And I would wonder, why would anyone do that? Why wouldn't Nissan just develop a little car instead of going to their rival, which is Suzuki, and buying a car and badging it a Nissan? So again, one of my colleagues said that, look, in Japan, you establish relationships with the dealer. The actual dealer and the dealership is a personal relationship. And when you want to buy a car, you choose your dealer and not necessarily the brand. So if you go to the dealer and you want a tiny car, and that brand doesn't make it, you'll be disappointed as a customer, and the dealer will be disappointed that he couldn't satisfy your request. So this is why companies do that. Mazda does this as well. They go to Nissan or they go to Suzuki and they literally buy the car, rebadge it and sell it in a Mazda dealership. They don't do that anywhere else in the world, by and large.
Well, I
but
think
in Japan they do.
We had in the 90s, Ford and Mazda had some sort of arrangement with and so, like, when I came over to Europe, I saw that in actual fact some of the Mazdas that we thought were Mazdas were actually Fords rebadged as Mazdas. So, but that would have been I'm sure purely for economical reasons,
Yeah, and don't forget, Ford owned a part of Mazda at that point, for certainly a certain period. So there was some deeper badge sharing or platform sharing, but I'm talking about, companies which have nothing to do with each other.
Right.
But they still go and buy a rival company's product, which is not available in their portfolio, and they'll sell it at their dealerships because the dealers don't want to turn their, long time customers away. And wow. I just found that so incredible, so the more you understand about society as a designer, the more you understand these fine things, ask a lot of questions wherever you are. I think that helps you sort of decode the world a lot better.
Yeah, well, understanding human behavior is understanding consumer behavior at the end of the day, and you are in the business of creating consumer products. So you
That's
should.
right.
Yeah,
That's right.
great advice.